Good morning, Skalk van Merwe, and the date of this recording, this video is 22/7 of 2022. The subject matter relates to polygraphing in South Africa. Now, the past 2 weeks, there's been quite an amount of discussion on Facebook relating to the issue of polygraphing. Here are the simple facts, and I want people to understand where polygraphing fits into the legal picture of South Africa, what the polygraph test is, and the effect of it on law and legal processes. Okay, let's start off with the most basic. Let's see and investigate what polygraph testing is. Polygraph testing is a pseudoscience through which certain body responses are observed through various mechanical and electronic means to ascertain whether a person's body shows any signs of response to certain questions. Now, the scientific theory behind it, the pseudoscientific theory, and I'm going to explain in a while why it's pseudoscience, not real science, is that if a person's body becomes under stress because he is lying or he is being deceptive, you can then measure certain parameters. For instance, blood pressure, for instance, heart rate, for instance, sweat on the palms, etc., etc. So the industry or the technology of polygraphing rests on the basis that a person's body will have a reaction or a response if a question is asked, and for some reason the body then experiences stress and causes a certain response. Now, why is this pseudoscience? For the very simple reason that the person doing the polygraph is usually not a medical expert. So in other words, he cannot give expert evidence as to the body, the physiological responses of a person's body. He can just simply say, well, in my test, this and that and the following happened. And that is where it stops. So it's a simple observation that the polygraph tester can testify to. Pseudoscience, real science, would mean that an expert in physiological responses of a person, that would be a doctor, for instance, will have to testify in addition to say that this and that and the following is now medically and scientifically provable or proven, and therefore a certain conclusion can be drawn. Okay, now that does not mean that polygraphs per se are evil or against the law or even not necessary. There's a whole industry in South Africa relating to polygraphing. It's highly regulated. Thankfully, unfortunately, we do get very unethical persons who also do polygraphing. But it's for the most part very well regulated, and the people doing the polygraph testing are usually very ethical people. I cannot point fingers at specific persons to say that person is doing this unethically. The problem is just that because it is pseudoscience, in South African law, it is not allowed as evidence in court. In a civil court of law, you can forget about bringing your polygraph test to prove anything. In a criminal investigation, it will maybe count as just an indication of this is why and how we investigated a certain person or a certain situation. In the CCMA and in a disciplinary inquiry, the mere fact that a person failed a polygraph test, and there's case law aplenty for this, cannot be seen as substantive reason for dismissal. Because it is not expert witness or expert testimony per se, it's highly doubtful whether it will even be allowed to be heard by a court of law, by the CCMA, or by any other forum in a way of the law of evidence. Okay. How does polygraph work, or the process that is followed? The polygrapher before test, it's called the pre-testing phase, will have a conversation with the person relating to the subject matter. He will have ascertain from the person if he understands, if the person is maybe taking any kind of a psychedelic or a drug that causes his body not to respond. If the person took alcohol, if the person had enough sleep, there's a host of tick boxes to go through, and only after the pre-testing has been done successfully would the ethical tester then subject is subject to a test. There's various things that can cancel testing out. I'm not going to discuss it here. I don't want to give the bad guys the knowledge of circumventing polygraphing, but just be advised that there's a whole pre-test procedure that needs to be followed. Then, very importantly, you cannot test a person without his consent. So there must be a consent form, an informed consent form signed off by the subject to be tested. Once again, if a person refuses to undergo a polygraph test, no negative inference can be drawn from it. There's also a plenty case law about that. So the long and the short is a pre-testing process must take place. Then the test itself takes place. During the test, certain questions are posed to the subject. Please forget about the Steve Wilkos scenario or what you see on movies with machines and all little needles going up and down and ends and forth. It's usually a quite relaxed process during which certain questions that are not relevant are posed to a person and certain questions that are relevant are posed to a person, and then the difference in his bodily responses to these two types of questions are then analyzed, usually mechanically or electronically, by the machine itself, to the machines that's coupled to his body, and then interpreted by the tester. Now, okay, what can be the outcome of this testing? There can be three outcomes. The first one is that the person so-called fails the polygraph. Now, all that means is that the bodily responses show that he was deceptive in certain of the relevant questions, in answering of certain of the relevant questions. It does not say that he lied. It just simply says that his body showed responses consistent with what in pseudoscience would then be seen as to be deception. So that's the first outcome of the first possible outcome of a polygraph. The second one is where the person is successful with his polygraph test, where there's no undue responses, and he's seen as to be non-deceptive. And the third outcome, of course, is where no test result can be ascertained for whatever reason, and an inclusive test comes back to the polygraph tester. Okay. But then the most important part of the testing takes place. If a person is shown to be deceptive on certain of the relevant questions, then a post-test interview is done with that subject, where he is given an opportunity to explain why there was a certain response in his body relating to some of the relevant questions. And sometimes during that interview, and this is very important, and I'm going to explain to you in quite an amount of detail what happens here. Sometimes during this post-test interview, there are admissions or confessions, and those may be recorded by the polygrapher, and it can be used later on in a court of law, then totally separate from the testing itself, but as an admission or confession. Now, what are we speaking about here? This is law of evidence. In terms of law of evidence, you can make certain admissions. In other words, there are certain facts or certain issues that you admit to. So you place it outside dispute. In other words, the party alleging something against you does not have then the onus to prove that any longer, because you made an admission, you admitted it. The bigger brother, the further step is where a full confession is made. Now, what is a confession? In terms of criminal law, a confession would be where a subject or a person then makes a detailed admission of all the relevant elements of a crime, and he confesses and say, yes, I did it, and I did it in this way. He gives an explanation. He declares that it was not done under force, that it was not done by coercion, that he was fully within his mental capabilities when he was doing it, etc., etc. Usually confessions take place in front of judges or magistrates, just to make sure that it can be indeed later on handed in court as a confession. Now, confession, as I said, it's a little bit a step further than an admission. So sometimes during these interviews, the polygraph tester will find the employee giving certain information and explaining certain things that by its very nature are admissions to certain facts or certain issues, and it can become a confession if it is done correctly. So obviously that can be given in as evidence before court if it is done, once again, within the bounds of law and legally. Okay, so that sums up broadly what we mean by polygraphing. Okay, here's the thing about polygraphing. Unfortunately, polygraphing is a pseudoscience. Unfortunately, is so that the outcome of the test itself has no real legal benefit or prejudice for the person being tested. It is usually only used as a tool to direct an investigator into the right direction, because sometimes you are sitting with a host of or a number of subjects or suspects in a certain crime that was committed or a certain incident that took place. So now you test all of those people, and it becomes clear who could be or who most probably was involved, and therefore your investigation can focus onto them. To try and do polygraph testing at the end of an investigation is pure folly. It's nonsense. You start off investigations with polygraphing, but once again, as I said, the test itself is of very little, if any, help. It's usually the admissions or confessions during the post-test phase that can count against you if you are not clued up enough to protect yourself as a subject there. Yes, a legal opinion or legal experts during this testing, I've never encountered, I must be honest with you, never encountered a polygraph test where an attorney or an advocate is sitting there with his client doing this testing. There's a very good reason why. You must remember that though the actual probative value, in other words, what you can prove, value of polygraphing is very low, it does have the possibility of swaying a case on public opinion or in the mind of a presiding officer who happens to hear about this towards or against a person. Now that is very dangerous. That is very dangerous. And that is why polygraphing must be done in the most ethical way possible, and of course with the consent of the person. And if the person then does not consent, no negative inference can be drawn. It's his choice or not. Just the same as in the criminal courts of South Africa, we are a state, a country that is a state ruled by law, and the rule of law is applicable. Therefore, you have constitutional rights in court as an accused person. It goes so far as to say that the state must prove beyond reasonable doubt that all the elements of the offense was indeed committed. Only after that happens do you have to answer on that. Do you have to rebut what was said by the state. Okay, so there's no thing in South Africa that you must prove your innocence before going to court. That's absolute folly. The moment a person tells you that, you know that person does not even know the basics of law, the law of evidence or the law of procedure, and he does not, he cannot qualify himself to be an expert if that is the way of thinking. It's handy if a person can give in a polygraph test to show he was not deceptive. However, if that is going to bear any real weight in a court of law is very highly doubtful, because there's also science showing that the person cannot be tested on his own accord, because he knows the questions that's coming. So the whole test can be swayed in his favor, and therefore it is highly unlikely that a positive test, a win test, will carry any weight in a court of law. People must understand these things. People must also understand that polygraphing is a very common practice now these days in industry and in businesses, especially in the mining industry. There's a lot of polygraphing going on, with which I have no problem per se. In criminal law, it will never stand. In civil law, people are laughed off at the idea of polygraph testing. But yes, it can assist investigators in pointing them into the right direction of where to go and do the investigations on which subjects they must rather focus and exclude others. So it is helpful as an investigative tool. Okay, that relates to polygraphing. You can find me on skalkvandermerwe.com. I will post this video in due time also there. This video is going on YouTube first, and from there on it will be distributed to all my other social media platforms. And yes, feel free to contact me through my website or through my number 073-437-8187 if you have any further questions relating to the issue of polygraphing. And then also, if you need to send an email to me, you can send it to skalk@skalkvandermerwe.com, as simple as that. I hope you have a nice day, and thank you so much for the time you spent to listen to this video.